So we're going to be talking about mercantilism and more broadly the economics in the British colonies, and then you'll use this information to help you grade a long essay question using the AP rubric that centers on mercantilism. So let's talk about colonial economics. Remember, economics is really anything that deals with money and trade and things like that. So one of the things we want to know is how did they make money? How did each colonial region make a profit? In the South, we know that they make money off of agriculture with large plantations. They also have other small farms, and they're mainly getting profit off of cash crops like rice and tobacco. And we know that the South is going to turn to slavery to work on their large plantations, and that this will be a development that's going to continue throughout the colonial period and even after American independence, as we see the South reliant on slavery. In the North, because the geography and the climate was not very good for slavery, in the North they have very rocky soil, very cold, harsh winters, so it's not good for large plantations. They're mainly just growing staple crops that they can eat. So they have to make money in other ways. And one of the ways that they make money is the lumber industry. So they get a ton of timber from all of the forests that are around. They're going to use that for shipbuilding. They also engage in iron making as well as fishing, and they will be able to ship these raw materials back to England. In the middle colonies, we know they were known as the breadbasket colonies. They're growing grains, wheat, oats, and things like that. They're able to ship those again to England and to trade them in order to make money. So because they're British colonies and they are trading with England, we have several major port cities that develop along the East Coast in order to more easily ship goods across the Atlantic. Some of those port cities that develop are Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and then Charleston in the southern colonies. And so all of this trade kind of integrates with the larger triangular trading system that you learned about when you did the crash course on the Atlantic slave trade. So we can see these raw materials that are produced in the colonies are being sent back to England. England is sending manufactured goods to Africa, and then slaves and manufactured goods are going to North America. So colonial society was continuing to grow as their economy and the trade and all of that is increasing. And the backcountry becomes the most rapidly growing region in North America. So farmers in the older portions of the middle colonies have a standard of living that's unimaginable in Europe because there was more socioeconomic mobility. Pennsylvania was actually known as the best poor man's country because you could be a poor person. We saw this with a letter we read from the immigrant Johannes Hanner, who came to Pennsylvania and talked about he made more money than he did in Europe and things like that. So Great Britain, because of the growth of their colonies and their trade, will actually eclipse the Dutch as the global leader in trade. And what we see is that colonial society in the 1700s enjoys a multitude of consumer goods. And what happens, though, is that I think I pointed this map out when we did our Zoom meeting earlier in this week. We're going to see more wealthy elites, especially like down here where Charleston is, the port city. We see near the port cities and near the coast, we have wealthier people. In the backcountry, they tend to be more poor. So what happens is cities are going to grow and become more and more important. There aren't a lot of major cities in the colonies. And so the cities that are there, the port cities that grow up, become increasingly important. This is again why we see like Boston's going to be the center of revolutionary fervor and for the independence movement because there weren't a whole lot of cities. And so where there were larger cities, they became really prominent and important. So the city is home to large population of artisans. These are people who are able to make craft goods and things like that. And what happens is that trade unifies the British Empire. The British Empire becomes an empire of commerce. And not just trade with their 13 colonies, but also trade with their colonies in South America and Africa and in India. And so if we look at the large colonial ports in the 13 colonies, we can see, again, some of these ones that I already listed. We can also see what they're shipping out of these ports. So in Boston, they're making ships, they're sending lumber, fish, iron products. New York, it's mainly corn and wheat and lumber. And then in Philadelphia, shipbuilding again, lumber, flour, because it's the breadbasket colony. And then in Charleston, we can see that they're sending rice, indigo, meat, wood, and animal skins. And so what happens is, even though there is not an aristocracy in the colonies like there was in England, what happens is that as trade continues to expand, we see the emergence of a very powerful merchant upper class. So we already have a upper class of plantation owners in the South who were your really wealthy people who own a lot of land and a lot of slaves. But we also start to see an upper class that are merchants and traders that start to develop in cities in the colonies. So in the Chesapeake and the lower South, again, it's the planters who have enormous wealth. More in the middle and northern colonies where we don't have plantation slavery, we'll see a very prominent merchant class. So there is no aristocracy. There are no titles, so there's not dukes and things like that in America. And so social ranks aren't established like they are in England, but by 1770, nearly all upper class Virginians inherited their wealth, which means that the availability of land and things like that that were there in the 1600s, it's being kind of taken away and centralized amongst the planter class who are passing their land and their wealth down from generation to generation. So it's harder to become one of those wealthy upper class people. So Anglicization was one of your anchor points as well that you're looking at. The colonial elite, so the really wealthy people in the colonies, they don't think of themselves as American. They think of themselves as English. So remember, these are a lot of people who are having problems. They were struggling in England. They were coming to the colonies in order to make money and become wealthy. And as they become more and more wealthy, they start to see themselves as more and more English. They have achieved what they couldn't achieve in England, but now they see themselves on par with the upper classes in England. So they're not thinking about independence and becoming American. They're thinking about connecting themselves with the British Empire more because that's how they gain their wealth. So they're really desperate to follow an aristocratic lifestyle. That's going to lead a lot of planters to fall into debt. So basically, they're trying to flaunt their money, and in doing so, they're digging themselves into debt. The richest group of mainland colonists are going to be South Carolina plantation owners. South Carolina plantation owners are going to be the ones that own the most slaves, and they are making a lot of money, especially near the Charleston area. And so one thing that held the elite together was the belief that freedom from labor was the mark of a gentleman. And this is why we see slavery continue to increase in the colonies. And we also see the upper class thinking of themselves as much higher than farmers who have to work their own fields and things like that. So the belief and the idea is that freedom from labor is what made you upper class. You didn't have to work because you had people who could do it for you. So there's also a lot of poverty in the colonies, though. It's not as widespread as it was in England, but many colonists, as we learned about indentured servants and things like that, they can't afford their own land or plantations. A lot of colonists are forced to work as tenants or wage laborers because the access to land had diminished. Like I said, in Virginia, most land in the 1700s is inherited. And so tenant farmers are people who are basically working the land for someone else and getting paid to do so. So taking the colonies as a whole, half of the wealth during the mid-century is concentrated in the hands of the richest 10% of the population. And so that means 10% of the population controls 50% of the wealth in the colonies. So the better off in society tend to view the poor as lazy, and they think they're responsible for their own economic condition. That's going to create some animosity between the poor and the rich. So colonies were diverse with economic prosperity, but they also have a lot more liberties compared to what they have in Europe. So that all leads us into mercantilism. So we can't talk about colonial economics without understanding the system of mercantilism. Mercantilism is a system in which a nation, in this case England, increases their wealth and power through trade with their colonies. So the whole point of England creating 13 colonies in North America was to increase the wealth of the nation. So the mercantilist system, England wants to regulate its economy to ensure wealth and national power. Remember, in Europe, there's a lot of competition among the different European powers, and so England wants to cement itself as the number one world power through the trade that it has with its colonies. So for England, it's not necessarily about taking over places, but it's more building a foundation for commerce and trade to build its empire. In order to do that, they're going to pass something called the Navigation Act that require colonial products to be transported in English ships and sold at English ports. So what this meant is that tea from India couldn't be shipped directly to Massachusetts or any of the other British colonies. Tea from India had to be shipped on a British ship to England and then sent to the other colonies. So England was continually being the middleman and making money. So if we look at it this way, as far as England's role and the role of the 13 colonies, the colonizing country, in this case England, was getting raw materials from its colonies. So some of the raw materials that are coming from the 13 colonies are things we talked about: lumber, fur, tobacco. And those raw materials are being sent to England. In exchange, England is sending manufactured goods back to the colony, and it's selling these at high prices because it wants to make a profit. We look at it this way: the mother country, who in this case is England, is trading with its colonies, but it's not allowing its colonies to trade with each other. So all trade must first go through the mother country so that England can make more profit. We look at it this way: the mother country is supposed to be receiving gold and silver, food, and raw materials from its colonies in order to build up its wealth. So if we look at this image, we can see where different British colonies were located throughout the world, but all of their trading is centered on the tiny island of England. And this again ties into the transatlantic slave trade and the triangular trade. So the Navigation Act that I mentioned earlier, because England wanted a favorable trade balance, they passed these acts to restrict how the colonists could trade. The colonists can only trade with England. So if we look, this is how the Navigation Acts enforce mercantilism. Everything goes to England to be taxed first. So anything that's coming from their other colonies, it's got to be sent to England to be taxed. Anything coming from the American colonies, send the tobacco to England to be taxed before it gets sent to other parts of Europe. Everything has to be sent in colonial ships. And so the Navigation Acts are enforcing mercantilism so that England is collecting taxes and making more money. Okay, so that is mercantilism and colonial economics in a nutshell, which you'll need to understand in order to grade the long essay question.